With so much attention on the competing parties' economic policies, I spoke to Manu-Bhaskaran, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Centennial Asia Advisors. He told me that regardless of the election outcome, Malaysia's economy is set to grow.
The economy is fundamentally in fairly good shape. We've seen private investment as a share of GDP increase to its highest level in 15 years. So the good performance of the economy last year was not just due to pre-election spending, public sector spending, or any one-off factor. There's a real recovery in private businesses' attitudes and appreciation of the Malaysian economy's long-term fundamentals. Of course, in the near term, this is probably the most tightly contested election ever in Malaysian history, and some of the ground rules in Malaysian politics and the economy clearly are going to change potentially significantly, and so it's not surprising that for a short period of time, portfolio investors, or maybe even the real economy investors, defer decisions and hold off for a while.
We'll talk about the short-term considerations in a moment. Just tell me a bit more about the long-term. You say that there is confidence in the long-term picture. What is the basis of that confidence?
Well, after 97, basically Malaysia suffered a great deal. Private investment essentially collapsed as a proportion of GDP. I think it went down from 35% in 96 to something like 9% at its trough, and it's only weakly recovered until very recently. But last year we saw a huge spike in private investor confidence, and I think that reflects some of the positive effects of the reforms under the Economic Transformation Program. It also reflects very positive developments in Malaysia, such as the Iskandar region near Singapore reaching critical mass and taking off, so more people are now interested in making big investments there, whether it is in education, medical, manufacturing, logistics, or whatever. And you have a number of other economic corridors in Malaysia also beginning to attract considerable foreign investor interest. And as foreign investors pump in money, as the government improves the underlying economy, the domestic private businesses also show an interest in the longer-term investment picture.
But, I mean, what you've done is you've described a positive long-term picture on the basis of reforms and short-term elements that we've seen only in the course of the past year. And I guess that is the crux of the problem here, is whether those reforms, that basic change that we've seen over the course of the last year, is actually a long-term event, or is it just a temporary blip? Because let's face it, we've seen Malaysia promise industrialization, promise so much for so very long in the past.
Well, actually, the reforms have been taking place really since Abdullah Badawi took over as Prime Minister in late 2003, and have been reinforced since the current Prime Minister, Mr. Najib, took over in 2009. So they've got a fairly long track record, and the thing that has changed is that some of these reforms in the transformation programs and so on, the liberalization of services sectors, are beginning to produce real results on the ground.
All right, well, let's talk about the short term then. The old cliche goes, markets hate uncertainty, and I know there's only a limited amount of truth in that, but there is a certain amount of waves caused by uncertainty for sure. Now, if we see an election result here that brings about an entirely different government, it's going to have a profound social impact, if nothing else. What do you think that will mean for the economic changes that you've just outlined?
I think the manifesto of the opposition coalition alliance has been announced, and essentially they are in favor of all the good basic strengths of the Malaysian economy, keeping an open economy, openness to foreign investor, and in addition to that they have promised certain reforms to the institutional weaknesses that are still evident in Malaysia, particularly relating to corruption, transparency, and so on. I think foreign investors would welcome those changes. It's just that in the initial phase of a new government, should there be one, of course there's a lot of uncertainty about how exactly the new government would be able to come to grips with the civil service, which has long been used to a different government, and to all the uncertainties about the composition of the cabinet, how different parties will work together in the new coalition. So it's inevitable that there will be some uncertainty in the near term. But in the longer term, I don't think it's a huge issue.
All right. Well, what about if we see a return of the BN to power? You've said it's going to be a very close election. What do you think will happen if the BN returns to power once again without the two-thirds majority? Is that going to necessarily mean that the existing Prime Minister has the power to continue the kind of changes he's been thinking about now? And is there a suggestion that perhaps his own position might be under threat if he fails to deliver with a two-thirds majority?
I don't think anyone seriously expects Barisan Nasional to regain a two-thirds majority, given the way Malaysia has changed in the last 5 years. So I think as long as Barisan Nasional does reasonably well and has a fairly strong mandate to govern, then I think Prime Minister Najib can go to the UMNO party internal elections, which will happen a few months after the general election, and say that he has regained a mandate and therefore should be re-elected as UMNO leader. So a lot hinges on, I think, the strength of the Barisan Nasional majority should they be returned to power.
And let me just finish with one specific economic element that Citigroup came up with just a couple of days ago as a potential scenario. If the Barisan victory is a narrow one and the Prime Minister feels that he's going to need to maintain a feel-good factor in the country, that would perhaps delay the possibility of a slightly tighter policy and perhaps an interest rate rise, which could generate inflation in the economy. Is that a scenario that you recognize and consider likely?
Not really. Bank Negara Malaysia has won plaudits from across global investors as one of the best central banks in Asia. And there's a lot of confidence in how Bank Negara Malaysia will manage monetary policy and therefore inflation. I'm not so concerned about inflation. I think there is a concern that if whichever party comes to power, if they don't have a strong mandate, they would not feel strong enough to continue with the fiscal reforms such as the introduction of a goods and services tax and the rationalization of fuel subsidies, and that would then perhaps imperil fiscal stability in the longer term. My own sense is that whichever coalition comes to power, eventually I believe the right fiscal reforms will take place.